106.1 Real Access. It's the Monday evening show with me, Jon Kirkman, through to 11. I would just like to say something now about something that happened over the weekend, and it touched me personally, of course, because many of you know that I've done a lot of work with Yes and the various members of Yes over the years, and sadly over the weekend it was announced that Chris Squire had passed away due to complications with leukemia. Chris had been diagnosed with this a little while back. He was announcing it in May and stated that he was undergoing treatment, and he hoped everybody would wish him well and all the best. Well, of course, obviously all of us did that, but sadly it wasn't to be. I first met Chris Squire in 1980, oddly enough, in Manchester on the drama tour. And I met all the guys in Yes at that time, including Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn, Steve Howe and Alan White. Yes have always been a great band, and one of my favourite bands since 1972, when I first saw them, oddly enough, on the Old Grey Whistle Test. And the first song I ever saw, and the one that really hooked me in, was a song called And You and I. They've been through many different lineup changes over the years, but Chris has been the only constant. He was a founder member alongside John Anderson, who actually co-founded the band with Chris in 1968. And Chris has played on every single studio album and every single tour right up to the present. And I have to say that the news really hasn't sunk in for me yet. I am going to be working with Yes again at the end of the year. And in fact, we are working on a project together at the moment, which you will hear more about, I'm sure, in the coming months. For the moment, it just hasn't really sunk in, so I'm a kind of little bit numb. But I just wanted to pay tribute to a man whose music certainly had a big effect on my life, and I know on millions of others as well. Things will never be the same again, but it was Chris's wish that the band did go on. They've got some tours coming up in the next couple of months. They're also going to be touring the UK and Europe next year, and also Cruise to the Edge, of course, at the end of the year in November. And it was Chris's wish that the band continued while he was receiving treatment, and in that instance he'd actually asked Billy Sherwood, a former member of Yes, to take his place and cover for him while he was ill. The plan still remains. Chris has always stated over the years he would be quite happy for the band to continue after he was no longer in the band, and sadly today we're in that position. So with great respect and much love, I would like to play the very next song from one of my favourite Yes albums, and I think lyrically this is quite an important song for me. With regards, Chris, this is Wondrous Stories.
I woke this morning, love laid me down by the river.
Yes, and Wondrous Stories, and we're playing that in tribute to the late Chris Squire.
Wondering aloud.
I was devastated that Bill wanted to go, because I loved him so much. I wanted him to stay. But then I got very shirty with Bill and said to him that if he wanted to go, he ought to go now and not do another tour. Now, that's the worst thing I ever said to Bill. No, I mean, we're still friends. He didn't spoil our friendship. But what I felt was that if you're not committed to this group, you're not going to do more, then don't do anything else and let's just move on. Well, everybody else picked up on the same sentiment, apparently, because that's what happened. Now, Bill had offered to do a tour, and I regret that so much. I don't think I've ever confessed this so openly. Although I've told that story before, I've never really added to it that, it would have been great to have gone, because it slightly slants badly on Alan, and I don't think we want to do that.
Well, it's only in as much as that, for my long-term benefit, it was great because I had the opportunity to work with two very different drummers, and so therefore was able to walk around in different styles. And but there's no doubt about it that Bill Bruford's playing was almost diametrically opposite to Alan White's, in that Bill led with his snare drum and used his bass drum for accents and in a jazz-influenced way, whereas Alan White came, as we all know, from the simplicity of playing Imagine. Just very straight ahead rock pop drums, and so a completely different drummer. And of course, Alan and I have been playing together. I mean, we still call him the new boy, even though he joined in '72 or whenever it was. But everyone says, "Oh, when you went to the new drummer." And of course, Alan and I have had 34 years now of playing with each other. Yeah. But as I said, it was great for me. But yeah, obviously Alan's organic style then dictated the kind of way Yes Music went from then onwards. However, Topographic Oceans wasn't exactly a straightforward pop sort of album, so it's probably good that he was there to ground it a bit. That's all I can say.
I think it was the London dates, because that's when we sort of got round the rest of the UK. We did Bristol, as you say, we did Deeside Leisure Centre, Manchester Apollo, had 3 great nights at Glasgow Apollo, Newcastle City Hall, we did 3 nights. They were all pretty good. It was when we went down south where, people are a little bit more cynical, I think, and particularly the London crowd were very, very cynical. I think we had 3 nights at the Hammersmith Odeon, as it was then, and 2 nights at the Rainbow in Finsbury Park. And because of the proximity of, I think the Finsbury Park gigs were the ones that did it, because you're very, very close to the audience. There was a real animosity from the audience towards what we were doing, and I think at that point Chris was starting to doubt the wisdom of what he'd orchestrated by getting me and Trevor involved in it. And from that point, I think it was clear that nothing else was going to happen after that final gig at which I think it was either Hammersmith Odeon or Finsbury Park Rainbow. I think everyone just went home that night and thought, no, this is just not going to happen.
The album started with Chris and Billy Sherwood, Chris Squire, writing a lot of songs for Chris's second album. He's only done one solo album his whole career. And they kept sending me these songs saying, do you want to write some ideas on these songs? And that's how the album came together. It was more a very loose idea. It was only when we decided that we had to go on tour, we wanted to do touring, we hadn't been on the road for about 3 years, that it was a good idea to start an album to get on tour. And Rick had decided he didn't really want to stay with the band, so we decided to just make this album, and it was just a combination of a dozen songs we've been writing.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's true, those albums, I think Fragile, we had, I don't know, possibly a maximum of 6 weeks from the beginning to the end of the mix to do it in, and in some ways, because we had, we were getting very popular and being booked to tour, and of course, we wanted to expand our studio time, because we now realised a lot of the possibilities of working in the studio, working with synthesizers, and knowing that all that stuff took a little more time. If you wanted to get to the level of where the Beach Boys were at, and you couldn't really rush it. But but there again, the tradition was that an album took a couple of weeks to make. Probably the first Yes album probably did, not longer than that. So I remember, Fragile was, we just had a 6-week window to get it done between a touring schedule, and that's why there's really only 4 band tracks on it, and the other 5 were individual contributions, because we didn't have the time to rehearse anymore and find more songs to fill the album out.
I've been asked by this record company to make an album, and I said, well, I'm going to London, I'm going to get in touch with Steve and maybe Bill, and they could sort of join me on the album. Oh, and they said, great, that'd be great. And I said, well, Rick's there as well, so I'll give him a call and see if they want to join in. And then I thought, wait a minute, why don't I make an album? And this is exactly what I did. I spent one afternoon with Rick, and I got some cassettes of his music ideas. I spent one afternoon with Bill and got a cassette from him of his drumming and ideas. I got a cassette from Steve. And I went to Paris and found this beautiful studio by the river, the Seine, just outside of Paris. And I took over with me 3 or 4 musicians and an engineer. And they had a studio in this beautiful house. And I asked them to perform and help me create this album that eventually would be an Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe project. So basically, I wrote the whole album with these session musicians, and then took it to Steve, Bill, and Rick, and said, "What do you think of this?" And they all loved it, and the record company loved it. And basically, they reinterpreted the music, because it was always like, I'd say to the guitar player in Paris, play this lick like Steve would play, sort of thing. And I'd say to the keyboard player, here's the solo, this is what Rick would do, play this idea, this is a tape of what he was thinking, and this is the drummer, and this is Bill, So in a way, I fashioned it to fit, like a suit. I was like a suit maker. And then we finished off the album in Montserrat. The only one who wouldn't come there was Steve. He wanted to do all his guitars in London. And then it was mixed. It was taken out of my hands, actually, halfway through, because they thought I was a bit crazy. And I wish they hadn't, because I knew exactly what I was trying to do. But it was taken out of my hands, and it was produced eventually by two. They mixed it in a beautiful place. Where did they have that big music festival in 1968, was it?
Oh,
in North New York State, very famous. Woodstock. Yeah. So they mixed it in Woodstock, and here's the story. It was kind of cool because about an hour away was this mountain skiing. So I'd get up at 10 o'clock while they mixed it, and I'd ski till 4 o'clock, and they finished mixing it, and I'd come in and say, okay, just bring that down a bit, tweak that, thank you very much, that sounds great, I gotta go and have something to eat. And the following day I go skiing again, and come down to the mix for the next song. And it was a really great way of working, because people, when they mix, they tweak this sound, they tweak the drum sound, they tweak the snare drum sound, and hours later, I'm sick of the drums. I just don't like them anymore, So I just walk in very refreshed. And the album, the performance was marvelous, because we had Tony Levin on bass, one of the great bass players. And it was just amazing how the audiences loved it. Wherever we played, and we recorded the DVD in San Francisco, near San Francisco. And the audiences were wild wherever we went. And of course, we didn't care whether we were called yes or no or maybe or Anderson, Bruford, Whitman and Howe. It didn't matter to me, as long as we can get the record out without too much trouble.
I never, at the time, consciously decided to do it that way. But in retrospect, one could have written a story that way, because everyone's wondering, because everything I did was very colourful.
Yes.
And everyone's wondering what colour combinations are going to come next. And Relaya was really a pencil drawing, and I've said it, jokingly, but it was almost painted with dirty water. It's got so little colour in it. And it wasn't a conscious intention to do a contrast. It was just how that should have been. It's just the right way to do it. And it's, to this day, it's definitely one of my top 3 favourites. I really love it. And not because it has no colour, but incidentally, it has no colour.
I really love the Earth collection. It started in Brazil, and Pedro de Gavia, which has, of course, got lots and lots of UFO sightings and things. And then we went into America, and I started talking to people who were involved with UFOs and sightings. They're very sane, sensible people, a lot of them. Met the odd nutter, of course, but there's a lot of sane, sensible people. And so I started the album, No Earthly Connection. And there was a story. I wrote a storyboard first, and the story was based around the fact that we have a soul and we have a music soul, because nobody really knows quite where music comes from. And when somebody is born, they're born with a music soul or whatever, and if they find it and use it, they can develop it to a certain stage. And when they die, it's then passed on to somebody else. And it's passed on at the stage you've taken it to, which is how music keeps developing. So it was the lifespan of the soul of music, really, which a certain person at A&M who remained nameless didn't get at all. The album, they really didn't like. They didn't get. I was very, very fond of No Earthly Connection. My band at the time, they really did get it. They got it, and they understood it tremendously, which is why they played it all so well. And it was a lot of fun to do, that album. I remember, though, that it only, I say use the word, it only at the time sold about 4.5 million. And A&M called my manager into an emergency meeting to discuss the album that they felt had flopped. Which, when you look at sales today, is quite ridiculous, really. It was Ken Russell. I love working with Ken. I mean, Roger Daltrey was Liszt. Paul Nicholas was Wagner. Probably one of the strangest castings was Ringo Starr as the Pope, who arrived on a Dodgem car, which was quite interesting, and I was the god Thor. It was great fun to do. I mean, that's an unusual album, because it is not the album that I originally put together from the film, because I always felt that film soundtracks let people down, because what they tended to get was a lot of little snippets of bits and pieces shoved together, and the main theme played 46 times. And so what I wanted to do with the Listomania album was turn it into a bit of a story, which is what I did. I turned a bit of a story. I extended some of the songs, some of the tracks, turned some of the small bits of music into proper pieces. And once again, somebody who will remain nameless at A&M said, "Don't like this." Now, A&M had some financial involvement in the film, so they had an awful lot of control. So they said, "Oh, we're going to remix the album and do it as we want to do it," which is what they did, and it got slated. It got absolutely slated, mainly for the reasons that I said to you. Said, why is it that soundtrack albums just have a little bit of this theme, a little bit of that, and don't have that? And I was really upset. But the one thing I did do, listening back to it, some of it's very good. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it was not forward-thinking as an album. What I did discover many years later was the original album that A&M had turned down, which we released on voice print as the real Listomania. And I rather imagine that when the albums are released separately, we'll probably stick those two together. But the Listomania album is quite collectible, because the film has become a cult film. It absolutely floored people when it came out. The Liszt Society, I was on their hit list. The Liszt Society issued the equivalent of a fatwa against me. It was unbelievable. Radio 4 did a whole programme, and the Liszt people, basically, if they could have knifed me on the spot, they would have done.
I can't imagine them threatening to do that to Roger Daltrey, though.
Well, believe it or not, they did. They sort of basically, they hated us all. And Ken Russell, as far as they were concerned, was the devil personified. Oh yeah, he was the devil. The irony is, as years went by, the Listomania film actually increased the popularity of Liszt. The film is now cult. It's not done Liszt or his music any harm whatsoever. And in fact, this year I'm going over to Slovakia to play in a concert celebrating the anniversary of Liszt's birth. So there you go. What goes around comes around. The idea for a double album, that was Tony Visconti. A&M were insistent, because everybody was using producers at the time, that it would be good for me to have a producer. And I said, fine, as long as it's somebody who understands me and understands music. And they were very happy with Tony Visconti. I'd worked with Tony, obviously, with Bowie and with Strauss. Good musician, really, really nice guy. And we recorded it on a mobile which was done at my house in Switzerland, halfway up a mountain in the Alps, which was great fun. Although Tony, being an American, didn't quite understand that when the snow came where I lived up the Alps, it really came. And I said, look, you're going to have to get this truck down before the snow comes, which will be sort of November time. And when it starts coming, trust me, it's not, oh, here's a little dribble and away we go. And he said, well, I'm sure we'll get some. So I said, no, it doesn't work quite like that. I said, and once it comes, you will not get this mobile down the mountain. And it came, 8 foot the first night of snow. And the only way to get it down, they actually airlifted it down in the end. It was the only way. It cost a fortune. But the album was fun. I mean, it was... there were some interesting sounds on that album. March of the Gladiators, I was always intrigued with the sounds that I got, because even we were talking, sort of late 70s, and there was a new digital kind of sound started, which the Buggles were doing. Trevor Hall was sort of, but there was also, it was the end of what I call a great analogue era, where there were some great analogue sounds that were never really used that much because of the sort of the arrival of digital. And I loved some of these analogue sounds that were the last of the set, I suppose, and a lot of them were used on this particular album. And we also did some fun things, which were a bit self-indulgent, but I'm still glad I did them. We wanted to have all different kinds of music on it. Tony wanted it to reflect all different kinds of music that I'd been involved with over the years. And one of the things that came up was trad jazz, because one of the first bands I ever had was a trad jazz band called Brother Wakeman and the Clergymen. I was 12, because I loved all the old Dixieland jazz and things. So he said, right, let's do a Dixieland track. I said, well, I've got a Dixieland band. He said, do it all on the instruments that you've got. Now, it'd be very easy to do now with all the digital sampling and various things, but back in 1978 or whatever it was not that easy. So the track, which I think was called Half Holiday, was all done on very primitive analog keyboards at the time. And I was really pleased with how it turned out. I mean, 'cause it does sound very genuine. The other thing we did in the same breath was Tony wanted to do Rhapsody in Blue, and again doing it with the keyboards doing all of the parts. But as I say, again, today very easy with all the sampling and various things, but back then it wasn't. It was a lot of single note playing, single line playing. We had a rhythm section which was 2 guys from New Zealand who Tony worked with a lot, who were super players, really, really nice. I have to say that a lot of the tracks musically on that album, if I'd have been in control of the album, if I'd been produced, they would never have been done. Rhapsody in Blue would never have been done. Half Holiday would never have been done. Woolly Woolly Tango would never have been done. Those guys. But having said that, when I listen to them back, I go, you know what, I'm really glad I did that, because sometimes it's very helpful for somebody else to say, hey, come on, do something a bit off the wall. It was an album that was liked much more on the continent than it was in the UK and America. For anybody who bothers to have a good look at the cover, believe it or not, that was halfway up the mountain in my back garden. And I arrived there, and there was the Red Lion pub in Red Lion Square. And I went up to Adam, to Melody Maker offices. Chris Welsh was there. And I said, hello, Chris. He said, oh, hello. I said, just passing and just wondered if you fancied a drink. I went, oh, yeah, great. So we went down to Red Lion. And I didn't say this. He said, what are you up to? I said, well, just putting together the concerts for King Arthur. He said, oh, fantastic. Where are they going to be? I said, I can't really say. It's all a bit hush-hush at the moment. He said, oh, come on, off the record, tell us. Now, off the record to any journalist, as you know. I went, oh, all right, because it's you, Chris. And I said, I'm going to do it at Wembley, the Empire Pool, as it was called then. He said, well, I said, on ice. He said, on ice? I said, yeah. Building a castle in the middle. I'm having about 100 ice skaters around depicting all the scenes with the choir. And he went, wow. I went through the whole thing. And I said, anyway, mum's the word. He went, absolutely. Came to the Thursday when the Melody Maker came out. It was on the Tuesday. There it was, front page, King Arthur on ice. And Brian Lane phoned me up. He went nuts. He went absolutely nuts. He said, have you any idea what this is going to cost? Will you ever learn? Because, I mean, with the Joe Centre of the Earth, I took a symphony orchestra around America, used every penny I'd earned from the album to do the tour. And I said, it'll be great. He went, oh. So we sold 3 nights at Wembley. I had all these ice skates. I mean, ice skating wasn't even popular in the UK. So I shipped them all in from Eastern Europe and from Australia and all sorts of things. And what was interesting was that Brian sat me down with the accountant, David Masterton, and they said, right, you sell out 3 nights at Wembley Empire Ball. And they handed me a piece of paper. They said, this is how much money you're going to lose, selling every ticket. I went, okay, there you go. And they said, and that will put you back to normal again. You keep doing this. You sell loads and loads of it, and you spend it on the concert. I went, yeah, there you go. But it'll be great fun, won't it? And they went, well, you're completely barking. Now, the interesting thing was, up until about the time of the concert, I think Arthur had done about 2.5, 3 million at the time. That ended up doing 14 million as well. And a lot of it was down to the fact that even though we only ever did those 3 shows, it seemed like everywhere in the world that I went to, everybody knew about that show. There was photographs. It seemed to travel all around the world. And it became one of those concerts that there's a couple of things I found quite funny. It was that in magazines when they have polls on best concert ever or biggest folly ever, it's always in the top 3 of both categories, which I find quite funny. And the other thing, I suppose, is that if I could have a quid for everybody who said that they were at one of those concerts, oh boy, I'd be a rich guy. And I will do it again. It will be done again, on ice.
If you look at a band like Yes and you look at the career that they've had and you know, the enormous volume of music they've put out over the years, and it really is a tremendous catalogue of work, you know, and I think that you know, I'm privileged to be involved in at least 2 chapters of that book. And I think that Yes music will go on, you know. I don't think it, you know, you hear people say, well, such and such should be in the band. It's not really about that, you know. The whole thing about Yes is that it's about the music that's created by whoever's in the band at the time. And I think that, you know, people never, for instance, acknowledge Trevor Rabin's era period, but I mean, you know, I think that's as justifiable as any other period of Yes, and in so much as, you know, it showed then at that time that Yes had a different angle and they could present themselves in another way. And I think that's important, is that a band can constantly reinvent itself. And I think that's why the band is still going 43 years later.
He had done lots of work in Paris with others, and I can't even for the life of me remember who, but it might have been Julian Colbeck among others, and whoever he started that record with. And he more or less came to me and said, you know, do you want to be on my solo record? And I thought it was a John Anderson solo record. And I think he probably thought it was too. It's nothing like Yes in the 70s, really. And the principal way of creating it, that is that we all sat in a room in the 70s, he very wisely had not adopted that policy. And under his strict own personal supervision, he'd done half an album. What he needed, what he wanted, and what he thought he would like is for people like me and Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe to sprinkle our fairy dust, such as that might be, on what he'd done and bring it to life. We did that, and it was possible to do that because John had already taken a key musical decision. The compositions were effectively there. So people like me were replacing drum machines in my own style.
I guess, you know, I was obviously by far the youngest in the band, so the grueling side of it didn't really hit me. I'm sure it would today. It was over the top. It was, you know, it was definitely saliva dripping out the promoters' mouths, along with a bit of blood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the tour being so big, the only thing that surprised me about that tour, there was a live video, but there was not a live album, and there was a sort of mini album which had some of the soundtrack from the video on there, and it had the solos, 90125, it was 9012 Live, the solos. Is that a regret not maybe capturing that show on a double live album, a la sort of kind of Yes songs or Yes shows or whatever? I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity, personally.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if there was time and we could locate where the tapes are, I know they were a couple of analog 2 inches linked together, so it's not like it's not there. It could be done, but... yeah, there's a couple of things. One of the biggest disappointments for me, or regrets for me, is I did a tour on my album Can't Look Away.
Yeah.
And there's an album, because we recorded it, and
I have it.
The band was playing very well, and I'm just sorry there wasn't a video of that.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I'm thinking, really, is that also, from a business point of view, live albums are notoriously used as contract bargaining chips and also contractual fillers, so I'm quite surprised that the management didn't think along those lines as well.
I think possibly the reason with Yes why it didn't become an issue is because there was never the thing where we had to deliver whatever, say 6 albums
right.
in a certain period, and we had 2 to go, because the band was in such a state of disarray most of the time that nobody knew who the band was going to be, or if there was going to be one, from one day to the next, pretty much. Jon Kirkman, who was Geffen's A&R guy, said to me, listen, we really want you to join this band with this music you've written. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I really want to do a solo album. And they said, look, you have to join this band, or we're going to drop you. Was, I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what happened. And my manager said, you should go and do this. Just you at least go through the motions. And so, yes, I went to London and spent a day or 2 maybe, I can't remember, playing. It was pretty forgettable at the time, but played. I remember we played Heat of the Moment, and we played a couple of my songs.
So who was actually in Asia at that point? Was Jeff Downes and Steve Howe in the lineup at that point?
Yeah, at that point, that's exactly what it was. And it's funny because when Jon Kirkman said to me, Steve Howe's now in the mix, I said, well, then what do you need me for? You've got a guitarist. He said, oh, you could work together. And I said, no, our styles are so completely different. It wouldn't work. And I'm sure it's not something he desires, and certainly not something I desire.
ABWH's manager, who wants to sell a tour, obviously has somehow to explain to people, if he wants to get anybody in the stadium at all, that ABWH is somehow related to Yes. So he's going to use the word Yes as much as he can. People in California are going to say, don't use the word Yes at all. The difference between the two is worthy of legal action. That's fun and games in their department. There's nothing I can do about that. I can't control any of that. That's the way the music industry works. If I can't do anything about something, why would I bother about it? In fact, the phrase, when the band went on tour, we used the phrase, I think, an evening of Yes Music Plus.
Yeah.
And I think that has been haggled over, negotiated one way or another. I don't know what the results of the negotiations were, but that seemed okay, and we were allowed to proceed with that, as I understand it.
We'd actually done some sort of test shots on Sam Sorden, the guy who lends us his studio. We'd actually used his, probably a Hasselblad, sort of 6x6 camera. And I think I've got them somewhere, some black and white prints, just of the back of the Marshall stacks, big speakers with the amps on the top, with Yes stenciled across the back, And sort of 2 of them, I seem to remember, there was a pair of them. We'd done these test shots in the studio in black and white. And that was going to be, we were working to John's idea, which was, I think, one of the very few, if not the only time, I'd ever actually worked with an art director who'd sort of said, this is what I want you to shoot, sort of thing, And as I say, we managed to to set the the equipment up, the Marshall stacks, and we managed to set up the electronic flash and Sam's Hasselblad and loaded it with film, and doing all this testing while we waited for the band, who arrived sort of fairly late, for our appointment, and turned up, and we couldn't get the bloody stuff to work. The flash just stopped working, and it was Sam's stuff. He was there sort of giving me advice and, of course, looking after his own equipment, and he couldn't get it working. And we tried for a little while, and time was slipping by, and because of this crash the previous night, they'd arrived late for our appointment, and they were due somewhere else for a gig that evening, so they didn't have sort of time to sort of hang around while we sorted Sam's studio out. With the studio thing having failed, I said to John, well, let's hop in a cab and go to my place, brew up some tea and think about it and do whatever. As I say, the expanded polystyrene head was just lying around, I don't know, in a tip or sort of in the road or something.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing that you see in a hairdresser, a lady's hairdresser. I bought this infrared film. I think I'd had another roll or two of it at one point, which I'd tried sort of messing around and experimenting with. And I just thought, well, let's use this. I suggested that to John. He said, yeah, do whatever you like. I thought rather, because they wanted something in colour, or John wanted something in colour, as were the photos at Vision and in the Lyceum. So I thought, well, rather than sort of, doing it more sort of Ektachrome or Kodachrome or whatever, let's try this weird stuff,
Trevor himself would never have considered himself to be a vocalist by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, he was, in all intents and purposes, a bass player. That was where Trevor came from. When I started working with him on the Buggles, he was actually he was a session bass player. That was his job, and he had a sort of little thing about having a small recording studio that he used to tinker around with and experiment with. So vocally, it was not his bag, and I think that all things considered, bearing in mind what we had to pull off, I think for the most part, it came across okay. And it wasn't so bad in America. I think it was when we got into England that when we were doing things like Madison Square Gardens, you're so far away from the audience, and the whole thing has just become like a big sort of pageant almost. So the critical ear is not so heavily levelled because you've got the event value. When we came to the UK, and we had this quite extensive theatre tour booked, where we're right in front of the audience, and that's really when there used to be quite a bit of barracking coming in, when particularly aimed at Trevor.
Well, yeah, I mean, what happened there was that, as we know, Rick had been in and out of Yes, and as he continues to this day to sort of do these away missions, as they call them in Star Trek, and he tends to, gravitate backwards and forwards. And I guess John also wanted to give that a go because he was, I believe at the time, was about to or did do a solo tour. And I guess he played I remember going to see him at the Albert Hall with this backing band, and I didn't quite know what to make of it, really. But, it was all, sounded fine and everything, but it was just a bit odd to see. So obviously what the bottom line of that is that both those two guys obviously felt the need to go and do things outside of the band. So that left Alan and Steve and myself, and we'd already started rehearsing for the drama album, or that wasn't called that then. We'd just been rehearsing and we had ideas for tunes. And what actually happened was that Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes had hooked up with Brian Lane, who was our manager at the time, mainly because they were both big Yes fans, and they'd both become hugely successful with Video Killed the Radio Star. In fact, the biggest selling single ever worldwide, I think, or in the charts for the longest amount of weeks. And so, of course, Brian lucked out because they loved Yes as musicians, and they ended up in our office just about the same time. So I just was in the office one day. I said, well, you play keyboards, you sing, and obviously you know how to write a hit. You want to come and join the band? And of course, I had a tough job selling it to Steve Howe and Alan White as well, that this was a concept. And then I also had the job of selling it to Jill Sinclair, who was kind of Trevor's counterpart and his manager to an extent. And, I had to persuade her that this would be good for Trevor to come and do. So there was a lot of work involved in pulling that lineup together. But as you say, the actual album came out pretty good, especially as once again we were up against a big time schedule. And there were tours that were already booked. In the States, was 4 sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden in a row. That people thought that it was when John and Rick were still in the band, the tickets had been sold. So it was like we had to make this album and get the band up to speed enough to be able to go and play to the expectancy of the fans. And it was a lot of long nights and a lot of lack of sleep during that period, but we did manage to pull it off, and as you say, drama has a quality about it that stands the test of time. Well, it's only in as much as that for my long-term benefit, it was great because I had the opportunity to work with 2 very different drummers, and so therefore was able to walk around in different styles and. But there's no doubt about it that Bill Bruford's playing was almost diametrically opposite to Alan White's, in that Bill led with his snare drum and used his bass drum for accents and in a jazz-influenced way, whereas Alan White came, as we all know, from the simplicity of playing Imagine. Just very straight ahead rock pop drums, and so a completely different drummer. And of course Alan and I have been playing together. I mean, we still call him the new boy, even though he joined in 72, whenever it was. But everyone says, when you went to the new drummer. And of course Alan and I have had 34 years now of playing with each other. Yeah. But as I said, it was great for me. But yeah, obviously Alan's organic style then dictated the kind of way Yes Music went from then onwards. However, Topographic Oceans wasn't exactly a straightforward pop sort of album, so it's probably good that he was there to ground it a bit. That's all I can say. Not only did Yes end up recording Every Little Thing, which is probably the song you're talking about, on our first album. But prior to that, we also, on our live show, did Eleanor Rigby and I'm Only Sleeping, which are a couple other, but they never made it to, I don't think they ever got recorded even at a John Peel session or anything. So we did 3 Beatles songs. Maybe there was one more, but it slips my memory right now. But we definitely did those. And of course, Yes also covered stuff from the Magic Garden album, which was Jimmy Webb songs, I think they were, yeah. which we liked. And what were they called? That vocal band?
Fifth Dimension.
Fifth Dimension, exactly. Yeah. So there was quite a bit of Yes cover versions of Fifth Dimension songs, and
a Broadway song as well.
Yeah, right. And Something's Coming from West Side Story. So eclectic little band we were.
It really started being a problem just around the time I saw you in Manchester.
Yeah.
I was my health wasn't all that great. Stomach problems, and it started in the UK. We started, I believe, in Birmingham.
Yeah.
At that time, and right then, it had nothing to do with my presence in the UK, mind you, but. I really started, not to feel so well, and then, unfortunately, the touring is so demanding that I kind of went into my reserves, so to speak.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, 3 shows before the end of the tour, I had to pull the plug. I really couldn't do it anymore. Things were going worse and worse for me, and I needed to step out I felt that I needed to put myself back together and fix whatever the problem was. It was the band that recorded Drama.
Yeah.
But I was doing the vocals. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. It was the Drama lineup that did that album. Yeah, he produced it. I mean, I know that there's some backing vocal tracks of his in the mix, far in the mixes.
Yeah.
in certain places, because there are tracks there that I didn't record.
Right. Okay.
So I think he added some stuff there, which is great. But the voice, I mean, I did all the vocal tracks on there, all the lead vocal tracks.
Yeah.
No doubt about that.
We were recording, and Rick's like reading a book or a paper in the corner, and there's Chris and myself working on something, and then it was just bizarre. And John had a separate little booth that was halfway up the wall with a glass window.
Yeah.
And he was in there. He had a painting easel, and he was painting pictures and an acoustic guitar.
Yeah.
We were actually doing a final take with the red light on and all that kind of stuff. And John, we had this music coming down that was nothing to do with the song we were playing. It was John playing another song.
For quite a few years now, people have been mentioning to us, you guys really ought to do some of this stuff with an orchestra. And we listen to people like that, but we've always had the keyboards kind of simulate an orchestra, because the band originally tried an orchestra on one of the first things it ever did.
Yeah,
and
Time and a Word, yeah.
Yeah, Time and a Word, and they played one gig on stage with it, and I think it was a little bit of a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And so they backed away from it from then. But we got to this point on starting this new album, Magnification, and we thought, well, you know what, maybe it's time for us to just think about when we write this, have an orchestra in mind. So it basically was John, Chris, Steve, and myself spent 2 months in Santa Barbara writing a lot of this music together, and it kind of like we left holes in the music for the orchestra to kind of perform,
Mm-hmm.
And then we had a great arranger, Larry Group Hay, who came up to Santa Barbara every week, and we worked with him for a day or 2 days, and he'd go back and write arrangements and try them out on keyboards with a view to putting an orchestra on at a later date.
Mm-hmm.
And it just all seemed to work out really well, because a lot of the stuff we were writing, we had that in mind. So a lot of people have had a great reaction to it. We're really proud of it.
They were playing Siberian True, which is on the Close to the Edge album.
Yeah.
And, I'd already been playing a bunch of stuff like that with my band in the countryside in England, which we'll get to later. And Eddie said, well, Alan can play drums if you want to rehearse a bit more. And they all said, well, okay. And so I just jumped in and started playing Siberian True with them. And I guess they liked what I was doing, because I fit straight in and played the song.
Well, we resented it somewhat, because we thought it was time to have another, song like, there were big songs, there had been, Someone Left the Cake Out in the Rain, McCarthy Park, there had been long songs and there had been hits. So we felt the Roundabout could have been a hit like it is, but their wisdom was actually right, because at the time the radio may not have played such a long song from an unknown English band, but they did play Roundabout, and of course it charted and got to be number something. I don't know whether it was one, but it was high, and so was Fragile. So it hoisted us into the level that we like to think we'd grown already accustomed to, which was quite a lot of success.
Well, the thing about that album is here's how it happened. There was Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe were doing another album. I, out of the blue, get a call from John, and he leaves a message, if you've got any good songs, we're looking for some songs for AWB. Is it
ABWH.
ABWH. And so I said, well, and I had Lift Me Up, which I thought was a yesy kind of song. So I called Clive Davis and I said, I just got a call from John. What's happening? And he said, oh yeah, we need a single. There's no singles on the record. It's not what we need it to be. If you've got a bunch of songs, especially we need is a hit single, and we need some other material. So I said, well, I've got a song, but to be honest, I don't want to give that song to Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe. It's because it's something I want to do. I want to record the song. It's not like Love Will Find a Way, which I still feel a bit guilty because I did write it for Stevie.
Yeah.
But Lift Me Up was something I wrote for myself. So Clive heard the song, and I sent it to him anyway, and he said, "Oh, this is the single. We've got to somehow put this together." And that's when it became, well, look, why doesn't all Steve Howe's parts? Steve was very unhappy apparently with the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe thing because the producer had replaced most of Steve's parts, and it was apparently not a happy place.
Yeah.
Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe album. And I said, well, look, I'm not touching that. But, what I'm prepared to do is do a couple of tracks with the Yes West Band, if you like, because I'd recorded these things, and I got Chris in, he played bass on it, Alan came in and played on it, John came and sang it, and we did Lift Me Up, Miracle of Life, and
Saving My Heart.
Saving My Heart, which was once again really not supposed to be a Yes song, but we did those three songs and kind of threw them together with the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe stuff. I think Chris went and played on some of the ABWH stuff just to kind of more legitimize it, and so it was really not a Yes album, but it was put out as one.
It was big. It was another summer tour, and I think I was happy to do it. Yeah, happy enough to try anyway. But I think it got a little farcical. I remember being slightly astonished, even me, I thought I knew most things about the music business, but I remember we'd done very well in Philadelphia early on, as we always did, with, 20,000 people going berserk, and it was just great. And they obviously got what they wanted. And we went round and did, another 6 months somewhere else, and then there was going to be a sort of a second leg on the tour involving another visit back to Philadelphia, maybe New York. And I naively said, "Oh, this would be great, because now we can play them some other music as well, And I realized that you're so tied into a show that even swapping the order of the music around is all but impossible, because it requires, lighting plots and different this and different that, different programming for this guy and that guy. It's utterly impossible once you are encased in the tombstone of a kind of tour. It's like a lead-lined coffin. There's nothing you can do with it once you've built it. You can't put tune 2 where tune 3 was. Yes couldn't. Other groups can, quite possibly. And they must do, otherwise they go crazy. But the sheer repetition, for me, after a while, is just too much. And I remembered, why I didn't like being in those groups at all after a while.
Well, it was a strange situation, because at the time, I'd always worked in music, but I'd always worked in it in a sort of part-time basis. I'd gone into music full-time for periods, and I'd had lots of commission work coming, and then when there wasn't lots of commission work, I would go back and do a job. And at that time, I was working in an IT department and working in web development, because I qualified as a graphic design artist in my teenage years. And I quit my job. I got the job. They said the war's starting in June or whatever. So I quit my job, and I was working my notice, and I think I had like 2 or 3 days left until I was due to leave the job totally. And John just sent me an email and said, "I'm sick. It's not going to happen," sort of thing. And I sort of went, "Oh, okay." What do I do now? And my house was on the market. My whole life had been sort of turned around to join Yes, because my wife and I had a young son, and she wanted to be close to her parents if I was going to be travelling around the world, and we decided to move house so she could be closer to her family. We sort of amended our whole life at work. And then suddenly this email came out of the blue, and it was like, "Oh, all right then, what do we do now then?" So I sort of sat down one night and just thought, right, well, we can't sell the house, and I can't leave the job, and so I ended up sort of trying to put everything back together. And then about 3 months later, I got phoned up by Steve again. He said, "Look, it's not announced yet, but we've got somebody else we're going to use instead of John. Do you want to still be involved?" And I sort of thought, well, yeah, I've made so many sacrifices so far to do it. I still want to be involved in it. It's still a fantastic opportunity. And so we sort of switched everything back on again and did the same thing again. And I was quite pleased when I got to that first rehearsal and it was actually happening. I must be honest.
It came obvious to me. I don't know, maybe end of January or February, that it would take more time for me to get back, to my normal self. And in condition, and honestly, there was nothing that I could see that that gave me a hint that I would be ready to go back on the road.
Okay.
In April, and that's when I I spoke to the guys in the band and said, listen, there might be a problem for April. I think I might need more time. And at the same time, I said, listen, time is precious. Last time your singer had problems, you decided to move on because you had waited long enough, and I don't expect you to wait for me. I don't expect you to wait for me, not knowing how long it's going to take me to come back to health. And so I said, if there's, I expect you to take whatever necessary actions to, for your band, and to continue and not just sit there and wait for me. So it was decided that somebody would fill in for the spring tour to give me more time to recuperate. And when everybody accepted that, I said, listen, if you have somebody there that is doing a good job, that the fans like, that the fans like and that you like and all, I would expect you to go on with that person.
Well, Tomato was an interesting album because once again, that had a variety of places that the music was coming from, and we were all writing and obviously trying to get our bits on the album, and there's release, which is almost our tipping our hat to punk. Really, it's a very aggressive, punkily played type song, even though it's kind of musical as well, but definitely it's got that element about it. And then there was Future Times, which is kind of cool, and it's got me playing like Neutron bass with effects and stuff all over the place, and Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman both saying who could play more notes in a bar than the other one, most of the time. It was like, who's that? Well, that was also to do with the fact that at that time John had started to come into the studio for the first time and whack down the chords and play along on his acoustic guitar with the band, which made Steve and Rick want to just play lead stuff all the time. So of course, then John would go, just take my guitar out now, and so there'd be this big hole in the middle, and it would just be me and Alan with some guys fluttering away up the top. But in a way, it was a kind of an invention in itself. Those tracks are interesting to listen back to, and of course, one of the best songs that I ever wrote, Onward, which was a simple song I wrote around that time, was on that album. And I was very happy with that. And once again, Andrew Jackman did an arrangement on that. Okay. So the chap who did the orchestration on Fish Out of Water. And as he did pop in and out of Yes history over the years and do odd little things with us. So the album cover for Tomato was a little bit. I wasn't sure what was going on. It wasn't Roger Dean. It was Hypnosis. It was Poe and Storm and this idea of Tomato, and then someone actually found a Tor in Devon. I think it was Poe actually called Tor T-O-R Marto, and we said, "No, you're kidding. You're making this up, right?" And he said, "No, there really is one." And then it kind of got druidy again, and then of course then we said, "Well, let's just have this guy who looks like he's divining for water, and let's smash a tomato on the sleeve." It was like. By then, I don't think anyone had a concept of what the fucking sleeve should look like, but but it went out like that, and interesting album though. And John's got that interesting track on there, "Circles of Heaven," which is kind of me playing a bit of reggae really, and interesting colours from the other guys on that.
I've been asked by this record company to make an album, and I said, well, I'm going to London, I'm going to get in touch with Steve and maybe Bill, and they could sort of join me on the album. Well, they said, great, that'd be great. And I said, well, Rick's there as well, so I'll give them a call and see if they want to join in. And then I thought, wait a minute, why don't I make an album? And this is exactly what I did. I spent some cassettes of his music, ideas, I spent one afternoon with Bill and got a cassette from him of his drumming and ideas. I got a cassette from Steve. And I went to Paris and found this beautiful studio by the river, the Seine, just outside of Paris. And I took over with me 3 or 4 musicians and an engineer. And they had a studio in this beautiful house. And I asked them to perform and help me create this album that eventually would be an Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe project. So basically, I wrote the whole album with these session musicians, and then took it to Steve, Bill, and Rick, and said, "What do you think of this?" And they all loved it, and the record company loved it. And basically, they reinterpreted the music, because it was always like, I'd say to the guitar player in Paris, play this lick like Steve would play, sort of thing. And I'd say to the keyboard player, here's the solo, this is what Rick would do, play this idea, this is a tape of what he was thinking, and this is the drummer, and this is Bill, So in a way, I fashioned it to fit like a suit. I was like a suit maker. And then we finished off the album in Montserrat. The only one who wouldn't come there was Steve. He wanted to do all his guitars in London. And then it was mixed. It was taken out of my hands, actually, halfway through, because they thought I was a bit crazy. And I wish they hadn't, because I knew exactly what I was trying to do. But it was taken out of my hands, and it was produced eventually by 2. They mixed it in a beautiful place. Where did they have that big music festival in 1968, was it?
Oh,
in North New York State, very famous. Woodstock. Yeah. So they mixed it in Woodstock, and here's the story. It was kind of cool because about an hour away was this mountain skiing. So I'd get up at 10 o'clock while they mixed it, and I'd ski till 4 o'clock, and they'd finish mixing it, and I'd come in and say, okay, just bring that down a bit, tweak that, thank you very much, that sounds great, I gotta go and have something to eat. And the following day I go skiing again, and come down to the mix for the next song. And it was a really great way of working, because people, when they mix, they tweak this sound, they tweak the drum sound, they tweak the snare drum sound, and hours later, I'm sick of the drums. I just don't like them anymore, So I just walk in very refreshed. And the album, the performance was marvelous, because we had Tony Levin on bass, one of the great bass players. And it was just amazing how the audiences loved it. Wherever we played, and we recorded the DVD in San Francisco, near San Francisco. And the audiences were wild wherever we went. And of course, we didn't care whether we were called yes or no or maybe or Anderson, Bruford, Whitman and Howe. It didn't matter to me, as long as we can get the record out without too much trouble.
Listen, that was actually at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, which is part of the Festival Hall complex. But, this is going back to when we were using cloakroom coat rails to hang Shaw mics off and dangle them above the violinists. I mean, It definitely it was very, very Heath Robinson, very early in the days of miking up an orchestra. So I don't know if anyone who was ever there, maybe they could let us know what it sounded like, but I doubt whether it was that balance between the band and the orchestra.
I think it was actually a combination of a number of factors. The fact was that Trevor was a singer and I was the keyboard player, and that was our little entity. Yes, we're working just as a three-piece without a keyboard player and singer, because Anderson and Wakeman had gone at that time. We're both managed by Brian Lane, and I think he was some way institutional in suggesting it, and the actual initial thing came about when Brian Lane asked us to write a track for Yes, who were then rehearsing as a three-piece at the Townhouse Studios with Chris Allen and Steve. And we wrote this song, which is called You Can Fly From Here, which a few people will probably have on bootlegs and that sort of thing. I'm sure they do. We did it with Bill Bruford and Chris Squire, and that was one of the tracks that was actually put forward on Drama. We actually did record it, and then the other material came about. We had I'm a Camera, which was then sort of modified into Yes fashion, became a much longer track, and that became Into the Lens. But effectively it was the same song, and Trevor and myself had the bones for that song. So yeah, I mean, it was. We went into a couple of rehearsals and came up with a few bits for Machine Messiah, and then I think Brian said, look, we should go with this, and do an album, a Yes album. And we had to see Armand Ertegun, who was head of Atlantic Records then. He came over and had a listen and said, yeah, go with it. So that's pretty much the background of how it all came about. And then Chris wanted to bring Eddie Offord back into the frame, because obviously they'd had, the classic Yes albums prior to that had been done by Eddie Offord, the early ones, like the Yes album and Fragile. And I think it was that era more than anything else that we were more allied to, rather than the Relayer going for the one period. I think it was much more, Chris Squire wanted to go back more to the feel of the Yes album and Fragile, and if you look at the set list that we did around that time, much of the material was in that sort of ilk.
Well, from that first audition with Yes in North London, sometime in August '74, to the first concert, which was taking place only a very short few months after that in America, I had to learn the content of 8 albums, really. Because technically there was 8, because Tales of Topographic Ocean was 2 albums, and Relayer, of course, made the 8th one. So some of the material for Relayer was somewhat, already composed when I arrived, but I had to fit in my parts and also compose some of course, brand new parts, for Gates of Delirium and so forth, and of course, Sound Chase and so on. I used to spend nights, the whole night, every night, after the recording sessions, writing down my parts on big pieces of paper, big plans, and it was an unbelievable amount of work, because in order to master all this material, I had to remember not only everything, but I had to remember all the moves. And I had jumped from 7 keyboards to 14 keyboards, and although I knew some of the material because I had listened to it very intensively before, and I had a lot to learn.
Yes, well, that was coming back in sort of Devon, I think. Down that way, Barnstable or somewhere around there. And it was pissing with rain on the way back, late, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And we were on a supposed freeway. Chris was driving, the rest of them, John and Bill and Peter were in the back. I was in the passenger seat. And we thought that it was a regular, motorway.
Yeah.
And actually, it was, the other lanes had been closed.
Right.
It was a big median, between them. And I don't exactly remember what road it was, or, why it was like that. But it turned out to be closed. And it was just two lanes. And we were overtaking a semi-truck, and we hit head-on into another car.
Oops.
Coming the opposite way.
Yeah. Oh, that's not good. Well, hopefully you recovered quickly.
It was not good, and the impact shoved the engine through the front compartment partially, and it hit my foot.
I thought it was a great thing to do, and I just walked around the streets with my portfolio, going to every record company and everybody in the business I could find, and I got an incredibly nice, enthusiastic response from Phil Carson at Atlantic in Europe. And he said, I'd love to have you do stuff for me, but I only have 2 bands, Led Zeppelin and Yes. But he did call me very soon after that and say, go and talk to the band. They're in Advision. So I did. We got on very well, and out of that meeting came the Fragile project.
It's like going through old photo albums or looking at school photos and wondering why you looked so silly and had such a silly hairstyle. And it's nostalgia. I mean, that's all it is. And it's nice to indulge on occasionally, but
you can't live in the past.
No, but once again, in retrospect, I mean, the album doesn't sound as bad as I thought it would be, because I've obviously heard these BBC things before, and all I used to listen for was the mistakes. Like, most musicians would do that. When you finished your new CD, you immediately think, well, I wish I could do that again. It'd sound much better. But now trying with distance, it sounds like a bit of, it's like dusting off an old scrapbook. And then I think, well, it's not so bad.
We're in Manchester, would you believe?
At the Palace Hotel, which is it's a very nice building, I have to say. Very conducive to interviews.
There used to be a guitar store across the road. I forgot the name of it. And when I had my first band, the Warriors, we used to come down here and stand around looking gormless, pretending we were rock and roll celebrities. It didn't do much for us, but it was funky just standing around, because we played at the Oasis here when it was a club in Manchester. And we used to go and hang around there in the afternoon looking, anybody spot us or something like that.
You were waiting to be discovered.
That's exactly right,
May the 18th, 1974, I had a house in Devon, and I was in the house actually on my own. And I decided, another long story, that musically, the direction that Yes were going in at the time, which was, following on from Tales from Topographic Oceans, and the relayer stuff was starting to be put together, that it was going down a route that I couldn't contribute to. And music is about give and take, and you can't just take, you've got to be able to give. And I couldn't give anything to the direction that it was going in, so I decided, much as I didn't want to, that it was best for the band and best for me if I left. I mean, financially it was a stupid decision, because Yes were booked to do like QPR, football ground, all sorts of things. And in fact, Brian Lane, who was the manager, said to me, "You're nuts. Swallow your ethical pride and do it. You'll make a lot of money." But I couldn't do it. And so I actually physically left on my birthday, which was May the 18th, 1971. And after I put the phone down from the Yes office, I was feeling very sad. Because even though I knew I'd done the right thing musically, ethically, I was sad because Yes meant such an awful lot to me. And then I got a call from Terry O'Neill at A&M Records saying, hey, great news, Jonas Centre of the Earth, #1 in the chart, the first A&M #1. I went, oh, great. And he went, you don't seem very happy. And I said, well, I've just handed him in notice with Yes, and it's just a bit of a strange day, and it's my birthday. And it was a weird one.
What happened was, at the end of the Sins' illustrious career, I ran into these guys. Clive Bailey was the guitar player, and I really can't remember the drummer's name, which is not very good of me, but he'll probably come back. And they also had a bass player. They had a three-piece band, and they were largely expressionistic kind of players in that flower power kind of way, where the actual level of musicianship wasn't terrific, but they had a lot of ideas, especially Clive. He was a good ideas man, not much of a guitar player, but a good ideas guy. So I just kind of hooked up with them. It was around that time when people were experimenting with all kinds of, drugs and music, and we played all the UFO, Middle Earth, and all the clubs that were around central London, that which were places to go and have a jolly good time. And what happened then was that during the course of playing around with them, and I never was really sure whether it was seriously going anywhere. We played a few colleges, and you know, we did a half an hour long version of Light My Fire to end the show, and you know, with an interminably long guitar solo. But I met John Anson towards the end, and John actually came along and sang with Mabel Greer's Toy Shop at a couple of shows. And what happened was that that was really the beginnings of Yes, and the drummer fell by the wayside at a certain point, and Clive Bailey was involved with some of the writing of the songs that were on the first Yes album, Beyond and Before being one. And during the course of rehearsals for the early Yes rehearsals, Peter Banks came in, and who'd been in The Sin, and came in and took over the guitar playing from Clive Bailey. So there's a tenuous link between the three bands. But it's hard to say it was a very serious project or not. No, it was a lot of having fun involved in that band.
Last week, David Gilmour issued his 4th solo album. The album is called Rattle That Lock, and this Saturday we'll be hearing from David Gilmour talking